Hello lovely people, welcome to a whole new, another gardening year. Ooh, it's so exciting at this time each year, isn't it? We can plan, we can dream, we can imagine. Yeah, I'm in my usual routine of first or second week of January or so, sometimes at the end of December, and getting down to the nitty-gritty of planning my garden for a whole another year of food. All my own homegrown food to last a year. It's not all the food. Obviously I do buy some stuff, but in terms of vegetables, that's it. I grow my own. And it does take a little bit of planning, and it's really, really worth it to spend a few minutes doing it. So that's what I'm going to do with you guys this morning. We'll come down onto the notebook and I'll probably do it in real time with you. Now, in some ways it's, how long have I had this garden now? 10 years or so? The planning in some ways gets easier each year because you just get more experienced, and all the time, whenever we're in the garden, we're reflecting on how well things are doing or how well they're not. I don't know any gardeners who aren't always thinking about the next year and what they might do the next year to do things better, or to do things in a more ergonomically simple way, etc., etc. So it does get easier as the years go by, and for me it's really easy because I've got the 4 main beds, each subdivided into the 5 mini perma beds. So it really is simply a case for me of hopping a bed over each year, or I should do it left to right like that, shouldn't I, for you visualising it. So by doing that, I've kind of got my crop rotation sorted. I don't worry too much about that. It just happens sort of organically by moving things each year. So that makes things really, really easy for me as well. But there are always things, every year there are things where I think, oh, that could be better, I could tweak that. I would say that where I'm at now with the garden, over the years I've done a lot of experimenting. I've tried so many different things, the soya beans, amaranth, lentils, chickpeas. I've tried all those wonderful things that are great for us veggies, and as time goes by I think, well, I'm glad I experimented, but it's not a good enough crop for me to justify the work and the time. I'm not getting enough from it. I think also, in all honesty, we're coming up for 5 years now since I started the channel. I think sometimes I did things that were a bit different purely to experiment on camera, to share views, what have you. I'm at the stage now where I'm not doing the garden for YouTube. YouTube can be in my garden when I'm doing it, but I'm doing the garden, it has to now be primarily for me and my food. So I'm always looking at okay, these are questions you can ask yourself too. What do you actually like to eat? If you don't like tomatoes, there's no point growing them. When you've kind of figured out what you like to eat and what you'd like to grow, and if you don't have enough space for everything, another thing you may consider is what's expensive for me to buy. So for example, potatoes and onions are never particularly expensive to buy. So you might think, well, I'll forego those in order to grow more salad leaves, tomatoes, squash. Organic squash can be quite expensive in the shops. Yeah, so work out what you like to eat and therefore what you'd like to grow. Think about where you're going to fit everything, and if everything doesn't fit, maybe think about losing the things which are, like I said, relatively cheap to buy. I grow onions because for me, I've got the space to do it, and I just really, they're something I use all the time in pretty much every dish I make, apart from pudding. It'll have an onion in it, so it makes sense for me to grow those. I try to grow about what does it work out? It's about 200 each year, 100 of red, 100 of white, and that's enough to keep me going for the year. And like I say, I've got the space to do it. I do still grow some potatoes because you know, I don't eat a lot of them. I'll eat them when they're in season, when I've got them available. But when they're not, it's, you know, I don't worry. I don't go out and buy any. And one of the reasons I do like to have them is, although I don't eat a lot, boy, oh boy, oh boy, the taste of your own homegrown spuds. There's nothing like it. And also, they're a kind of one of those delight crops for me because they're pretty low maintenance. And there's the joy of digging for buried treasure when it's time to get them out. But yeah, think about how much space you've got, what you like to eat. If you can't fit it all in, you just have to ditch something. I wanted to say this right at the top. Yes, it is a new growing year, and yes, we're all dead excited, really, really, really gagging to get going. But please, 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 hold. We see it every year. People starting their seeds right now. It's too soon. You know, if you think with tomatoes is a great example. From sowing the seed to actually planting them out in the garden, it's only going to be about 6 to 8 weeks. I won't plant my tomatoes out until the first week of June. It's just it's nighttime temperatures that I'm always concerned with. And the fact is, right through May, our nighttime temperatures, and it's not even about a frost, it's about once those nighttime temperatures are below 6 degrees centigrade, the chances are my tomatoes are going to keel over. So if I'm looking at a 6 week from seed sowing to planting out, that takes us back through May. Beginning of April is plenty of time to start tomatoes. Obviously, I'm talking about my growing conditions. But yeah, if you start your tomatoes now, you're just going to end up with really leggy, weedy, pathetic little seedlings, which, you know, they'll be, because there's just not enough light for them. They'll keel over, and by the middle of February, you'll be tossing the lot in the compost bin and having to start again. And hopefully you'll still have enough seeds so that you can start again. And even in the middle of February, to start again would be too soon, because they'll be ready to plant out at the end of March, beginning of April. And just think, you know, how many years ago was it? 3-4 years ago? We had the beast from the east. We had snow on the ground. You can't plant tomatoes in snow. Anyway, yeah, so yes, we're all dead excited, but please be sensible. There are things we can get on with now to kind of give us our gardening fix. One thing, I was mentioning this on Facebook the other day, it's time to start saving our free seedling pots. So for me, that is essentially, it's loo roll innards. I can either keep that whole for something. Oh, I'm going to try some parsnips in them this year. Not all I'll do some direct, some in these. Beans worked great in these last year for me, because beans like to do a nice long root. If it's a smaller start, like when I'm just starting the tomatoes, I might cut that in half. But obviously, you know, there's all sorts you can scrounge and reuse. Yoghurt pots, margarine tubs, etc., etc. Just give everything a good clean out. And if it's a plastic pot, just poke some holes in the bottom. So we can start to do our pot saving right now. We can also check our seeds. I'm going to do that in a separate video, because I can't believe I haven't even looked at my seeds. I haven't looked at my seeds properly since last June, when I was doing my last sowings. I need to get on with that, because I will need to, there are a few things I will need to order. And then, of course, obviously, we can start on the plan. So there's my plan for last year. Oh, we're going to have issues with the light today, because it's so bright. See, it's very simple. So that's what I'll be replicating in a minute. Before I start on this year's plan, yes, find me again, find the light. I look grey today, don't I? Have I seen a ghost? So thinking about last year and lessons to bring forward, last year everything went a little bit pear-shaped, and I think right through till about September, you know, the beginning of every month I was thinking I'm 4 weeks behind. So bearing that in mind, how can I make sure that doesn't happen this year? So I've gone backwards in my mind. A lot of that was to do with not getting my beds prepared in time. My seed sowing sort of pretty much did stay on schedule, but my bed preparation, my structure building, all of that got way left behind. So I've very simply said to myself, I'm going to have 20 beds to prepare. So some of them are still in use, and they'll be in use right to the end of April. So they can be the last beds I prepare by taking out the old brassicas and getting them ready for the new plants that are going in. But so I actually started this is a bit of a plan that I started, I think this was back in September, October, when I was getting really fed up of being on the back foot. If I've got, excuse me, if during the spring, so let's say from the beginning of March, if I do 2 visits to the garden per week, and on each visit I do one heavier physical job, such as prepping my beds, and then one other job that's a bit of an easier job, whether it be, you know, seed sowing, pruning, tidying, whatever it is. In other words, if I do 2 visits and each visit I've done 1 bed prep, that's 2 beds prepared per week. 20 beds, that means 10 weeks. It will take me 10 weeks to get all the beds ready. The chances are I'll manage 3, if not even 4 visits to the allotment per week. But I'm not planning that for myself because of what happened last year. I think it's absolutely perfectly realistic for me to expect and do 2 visits. So if it's 2 visits, if it's 10 weeks to do all the bed prep, if I start at the beginning of March, by the middle of May, all the beds will be prepped. And by then, some of them will have been seeded and planted, potatoes, onions, they'll all be in. By the middle of May, all the bed prep is done. And that gives me from the middle of May to the end of May to do all the structural stuff like erecting my beam poles, because that takes ages, lashing everything together. I love it, it's a great job, but it does take time. And then that means that by the beginning of June, as I'm getting the more tender stuff out, cucumbers, their frame is built. The beans, their frames are built. Do you see what I mean? So obviously that's a bit of a trickier one for you to translate for yourself, because your garden will be different to mine. You might not have 20 beds of that size. You might have 10 beds which are bigger. Obviously our climate may be a little different. You may have a smaller garden, you may have a bigger garden. But I think that's quite a useful way to plan, to think ahead, is how many hours or days can I realistically commit to the garden, and how much do I need to get done if you're in the UK. I think our big kind of cut-off point in the year is the beginning of June. That's when we can plant our squash out, plant our tomatoes out, plant our cucumbers out, all that tender stuff can go out. So if you're looking at the beginning of June and working backwards to say March, April, May, in those 3 months, how often can you visit? How many hours can you commit? How physically able are you? You know, you may be able to do 4 of my beds in one day. No way I can. So work backwards like that. Think about how many beds you've got. Perhaps you want to divide some of them up, rearrange them slightly. That would be a great thing to do in January and February before you even start thinking about planting. If you want to slightly restructure things, rearrange things, do it now in the winter while you've got the time. But once we hit March, that's the time to be thinking about your bed prep and your structure building. So yeah, like I said, my garden won't necessarily translate to yours, but you know, especially if you had the garden last year, you'll know about how the timings felt last year. And if it's a brand new garden to you this year and you really don't have a foggy about how much time it's going to take, at least just think a little bit about how much time you're willing to commit to it. And you'll soon find out whether that's enough time or not enough, and you might have to just slightly adjust as we go into the spring. You might think, oh, I do need to do a bit more time, or actually, I feel really physically able today and I can do masses in one day. So a couple of other things learned from last year, and I've got to say, just very quickly, I swapped over to the little mini perma beds. When did I swap? Was it 3? I think it was 3 years ago. I would say it's the best thing I've ever done. Far, far, far less work. You know, I used to have like a whole bed sown with stuff, or the paths would change every year because I'd want a bigger bed or a smaller bed. So I was digging up paths every year. Wow, so I'm just looking at an airplane there. It's taking... It looks like it's at that angle, but I think it's because it's coming towards me. Sorry. Yeah, so it's far less work, and it's for 2 reasons. One, I'm always concentrating my efforts in the growing bit rather than digging up old paths and trying to make that a bed the following year. So all the organic matter, all my attention, whatever it is, it's always focused on my growing soil. So that soil is getting better and better. Obviously, I never stand on my beds, I never walk across them, so I'm not compacting them at all. That's helping them to get better and better. But also, just in terms of planning my workload, I've got 20 beds. I know, for example, if I'm having a weeding session, if I'm weeding 5 beds in one of my main big beds, I know that a really thorough weeding session takes 1 hour to do those 5 minis within the big bed. So I know that those 4 main veg beds, that's 4 hours of weeding. Herb bed and other areas, maybe another hour. So it's 5 hours of weeding total. It's just really helped me in terms of dividing my time and not feeling overwhelmed, that I've got these little bite-sized chunks of garden that I can tackle. And I think that's been really important in the last couple of years as my body has got a little bit worse, but also, you know, when other commitments are happening all over the place, it's really useful to say to myself, right, well, today, you know, I'm not feeling great, but I do need to attend. So if I just do one mini bed, you know, my little mini perm beds, if I just do one bed today, that will be great. And more often than not, when I head off there with the intention of just doing that one bed, I'll end up doing 2 or 3, you know, because it gets me motivated again. That's the other thing about how to keep motivated through the year and not feeling so swamped and overwhelmed that you run away and you don't want to go back because it's all too much. I think smaller beds can really help, because you can always say to yourself, well, if nothing else today, I can do the bed that's got the tomatoes in, for example. Or at this time of year when the beds are empty, and maybe you're overwhelmed by weeds again, you can think to yourself, I can at least do that bed that had the tomatoes in last year, that's now full of weeds, I can at least get that one bed cleared of weeds. So, that wasn't a lesson learned last year, it's a lesson that's been continually learned for me. I love, love, love my new little mini perma beds. Now, last year, going back to this timing thing, I missed a couple of sowings, and actually it ended up being one of those happy accidents that improved things for me. So I'm just looking at my notes for last year. I keep very simple notes, really, really simple. I'm thinking this year, I'm thinking ahead to something I want to do. You know, I was talking about all the ideas that I've been bouncing. I'm thinking this year about keeping more detailed notes and thoughts. But until now, I literally have a note of when I sow a seed. I generally know whether that will be an indoor sowing or an outdoor sowing because I know where I sow stuff. And then there's other little notes. I might say the date they've germinated or the day I've pricked things out. I'll make a note of at what stage they've gone from this front window, which is really warm and bright. I then transition everything to out in my hallway where I've got a massive skylight. So it's really light, but it's north facing. So the light is cooler. It's generally cooler out there anyway. So that's their little beginnings of hardening off. So I'll make a note of that. Make a note of when things go down to the cold frame. And finally make a note of when I've actually planted it out in the ground. Really simple. I mean, you can see, look, that's pretty much that page and over on there. That's my growing notes for an entire year, for my whole garden. So back to this thing of the happy accident. So I missed 2 sowings. My cucumbers, no, they weren't missed. That was a kind of an intentional thing. I'll come to that in a second. I missed sowing my flint corn. And it was bugging me. It's on the back of my mind for ages. I would normally, so flint corn, for any of you who haven't seen those videos, it grows, it has a very similar look to sweet corn, but we don't eat it fresh for those sweet kernels. Oh, I hate sweet corn. It's for drying. You'll often see them used. They're multicolours, beautiful colours. You may have seen one called glass gem. And a lot of people use them dried to decorate their homes, particularly in the States. It's come from the States originally, for sort of Halloween decorations, fall decorations, really pretty. But I used to use them for either A, popping, so popped corn as a snack, or for grinding to give me a sort of flour. Anyway, I missed the boat last year with sowing. It was bugging me, and every time I thought I really need to get it sown, there wasn't an opportunity to get to the garden. I was really tied up elsewhere. And it got to the point I would normally plant them to follow on from the garlic, harvest the garlic, flint corn in. It was obvious it wasn't going to happen. So I ended up with a spare bed. I actually ended up with a couple of spare beds last year because the carrots didn't grow. And I thought, you know what, fine, I'm just going to bung in any of my own spare plants. So I had a couple of squash that were spare. And then one of my neighbours said, I've got a courgette that's spare, would you like it? Thank you, I'll put that in. And then 2 other neighbours also gave me courgette plants. So I ended up with 3 courgette plants and a couple of squash in the bed that would have been the flint corn. Fantastic. And this is what I mean about, you know, if this is going to be your first garden this year, or even if your first garden was last year, or even the year before in lockdown, you're never going to get it right and perfect in the first year. I don't think any of us get it right and perfect in our 10th year, in our 20th year. We're always, you know, experimenting and learning, and we ourselves are growing. But yeah, that was a fantastic lesson last year, because flint corn, I mean, it looks great when it's growing. Harvesting it is fun, but processing it is mind-numbing. They all have to be dried, and then it used to kill my hands to get the kernels off. And if I had to live without popped corn, I could. And if I had to live without it ground down to make a flour, I could. I did last year. The plants that I grew instead, the courgettes and the squash, in some ways, they're much more useful for me. I'm much, much more likely to use those and make a number of different meals from them than I am the flint corn. So yeah, it was fun to do it for 3 or 4 years, but it's not going to be in my garden anymore. I would much rather have space for courgettes and for squash. And the thing about that courgette soup I make that I'm always banging on about is it's, oh my goodness, it's mind-numbingly easy to make. It's really tasty. It's so scrummy tasty, and it freezes well. Why not produce a crop that is that easy? And the great thing is, even when the courgettes get massive, you know, when I had that sort of 4-week gap from the middle of July to the middle of August, and they went whopping, doesn't matter, they still make a great soup. So yeah, that's a good lesson learned. The other one I was going to mention, the cucumbers, that wasn't late by accident, that was a late on purpose, based on a lesson the previous year. I can just quickly look at my note for sowing times. So in previous years, I've sown my cucumbers at the beginning of April indoors. They need a bit of warmth to get going. And then they're ready to plant out towards the end of May, beginning of June. Not last year, the year before, in 2020, beginning of lockdown, compost gate, remember? Couldn't get any compost. So I ended up sowing my cukes towards the end of April, which is much later than, I think in previous years I've sown them even in the middle of March. So because I couldn't get any compost for ages, I had no compost to start them in. They were started a bit later. Then when I came to plant them out, they take a little while to get going, and then they suddenly go mental. And then I have all these cucumbers, but my tomatoes are nowhere near ripe. So I thought, oh, well, I can start them a bit later, having learnt that from Compost Gate. I wonder if I can start them even later to try and coincide their fruiting with the tomatoes fruiting, because I want those two things together. So last year I sowed them as late as the 8th of May. But then, if you remember, they were looking really pathetic. They just went, like a couple of nights in the cold frame, they looked awful. In a panic, I planted them. What date did I plant them? See, this is why this is so useful. Might take me a second to find. Oh yeah, so I sowed the seed the 8th of May. On June the 6th, they were planted out. But because they look so spindly, next to them I also did a direct sowing. The direct sowings did brilliantly, and they did come at the same sort of time as tomatoes. I mean, I'm not going to talk too much about tomatoes today because last year, blight, blah, blah, blah. But that's what I mean. We can have these sort of happy accidents. The happy accident of having no compost in 2020. The happy accident last year of losing my nerve and thinking they don't look right, let's do some direct sowing. So I've now gone from, oh, it's thumping outside, starting cucumbers in the middle of March to starting them direct in the garden on 6th of June. Brilliant. Yeah, so keep notes. However simple you want to make them, I would suggest that the main note you want to make is what day you've sown something. You might want to make a note of what day it's germinated. Certainly a note of what day you've pricked out or potted on, and a note of when you've actually planted it out into the garden. We think we'll remember all these things, but actually that's quite a lot of dates and different seeds. Who's going to remember it? So keep those notes this year so that next year you can reflect and think, oh, the tomatoes really struggled. When did I plant and sow? Maybe it was a bit early. I'll start them later this year. Does that make sense? I realised I was actually going to sit and do my own garden plan with you this morning, but I think I've talked on enough as it is. But I hope that's really useful. I think the biggest thing for me, it's always that thing of how were things last year, what was good, what was bad. It was great having courgettes of my own rather than relying on them ending up on the share table. So for the first time, I think ever, I just made a note, seeds for 2020. This is note to self, I wrote this ages ago. Courgette. I know, because I've always thought, nah, don't bother. But it was really great having my own supply. If you haven't had a veg garden before, and you really think like, I don't know where to start, you know, talk to friends who've done it before. Have a sit down with all your seeds, your seed packets. Look on the back what there'll always be a guide on the back to when you can sow, when you can plant, when you can harvest. Bear in mind it's going to be a pretty wide range of dates to suit most people, because those packets are going to be sold all over the place. The way I like to think of it is, you know, our little seedlings, they're like little neonates, they're like little newborn babies. I'm not going to stick a newborn baby out on the grass naked overnight if the temperature's only going to be about 5 degrees, am I? Think about when your frost date is, work backwards. For the most part, I would say we're not really going to be getting into much seed sowing until March. What did I sow in? In fact, looking at my notes, I didn't do any sowing in March at all. And I always have in previous years. I was tied up in March, but actually it all worked out fine. Don't be worrying about getting a head start. Starting things now, weak plants. It's much better to start later. I mean, obviously it's going to depend on your growing zone. I can grow right through to the end of September generally. But yeah, it's probably better to start things a bit later than it is to start them earlier. Right, I realise I'm just waffling on one now. I'm going to now sit and do my actual plan. And when I talk about doing my actual plan, what I mean is draw out the beds and just write what is going to be in them. Oh yeah, this is another lesson from this year. My cabbages, the Savoy cabbages, the ones that are really low to the ground and have been pecked to smithereens. So this year, I'm not going to bother with the Savoy cabbage. Now that I've seen how brilliantly well the Portuguese cabbage does. So if you remember, Paul gave me 2 little seedlings and they're now trees. They're cabbage trees. So rather than trying to fit in 10 little Savoy cabbages, which get pecked to smithereens and don't ever come to much, I'd rather have 5 whopping great Portuguese cabbage where one leaf is so big it's almost like a whole cabbage anyway. Just have a little, don't be in a rush to do anything, have a little think about how things went next year, have a really honest chat with yourself about, I think this is a really, really key one actually, about what sort of time you are prepared to commit to it all. You know, maybe last year you struggled and you think, I could actually do with 1 whole weekend extra every month to get the garden to where I want it to be. Or maybe it's time to hold your hand up and say, I can't commit to any more time. It really got on top of me. It really upset me how I just couldn't keep up with it. Maybe it's time to have a word with the committee to say, can I halve the plot? Can I just work half of it this year? I would say it's so much better to work half a plot and do it well and get enjoyment and produce, etc., from it, than try to manage a whole plot which just defeats you and leaves you feeling depressed and like a failure. Because you know what? Gardening should not make you feel those things. Gardening will thwart you at times, it will frustrate you, but on the whole it should be the most joyous, at times empowering thing you can possibly do. We have to be honest with ourselves, don't we? All right, listen, happy planning, people. I am going to now shut up. I'm going to do my plan for the year. If I actually manage to get this done in the next few minutes, I'll tip you down and just give you a quick look. I'm not going to hold you up too much more today because I realise I've been blah, as usual. So I'll say cheerio for now. I'm not going to say cheerio for now. I'm going to do the plan and we'll do it really, really quickly. Well, you can see I've done it very quickly and it's very messy. This is over here. This is bed number 4. It's the last of the veggie beds. That's where I've got my big rose bush. That's where the cold frame is. Then bed 3, bed 2, bed 1. And as you can see, everything has quite simply jumped to bed. So where the potatoes were all in bed number 1, I'm going to sneeze, sorry, oh, excuse me, oh dear, that's better out than in. Bed number 1 has become bed number 4, bed 4 became bed 3, bed 3, bed 2, bed 2 became bed number 1. So there aren't really any changes. Where I've got something written and then it's in brackets, that's my follow-on crop. So main crop potatoes, and then in the autumn they'll be followed by garlic, salad potatoes, and then in the late summer they'll be followed by purple sprouting broccoli, charred spinach peppers, yeah, no changes there. All my lovely squash, coco de pampol. Here in brackets it's broad beans. They'll come out and in will go the kale. This is where I made a mess up. Oh my goodness. I basically did this year again by mistake. Currently I have cavollo in here. It will be followed by squash, 2 beds of squash, the cukes and peppers, 2 lots of tomatoes, and so on. So here is what was the spare bed this year. Oh, and that one was spare as well. I'd sown a whole bed of carrots, nothing happened. This year I will try carrots again because I really do love them. And for 6 or 7 years I've grown fantastic ones. Don't know what happened the last 2 years. But then space for 1, 2, 3 courgette plants, which will give me plenty. When the garlic comes out, that's what in previous years I'd followed with flint corn. But as I'm not doing the flint corn, that will be followed by, I put question mark brassicas, but I think, what did I follow it with this year? I followed it with the cavollo. So I'll have, the garlic is in now. When that comes out at the end of May, in will go the cavollo, which you see, that's in brackets because it's this last year it went in. And then just a scribble to show where the bean arches will be, because I haven't actually gone through all my seeds yet. Eventually, on down the sides of here, I'll write down the types of beans, the variety I'm growing. So there'll be gigantes. There'll definitely be the Madeira Maroon again that Paul gave to me last year. They've been great. The Churchill Black, etc., etc. So I know how many. There'll be 3 poles on the end of each bed. That gives me 6 sowing stations. So 6, 12, 18, 24, 48, and the other lot of arches is 96. I know I've got space to grow 96 climbing beans. I just have to decide which ones I want to do. And that, my lovelies, is, sorry, that was a bit of a wordy one, and I'd meant to spend more time on this, but this doesn't change that much, and I'd rather talk about, you know, what we have learned and the lessons and how we can apply and think about that main thing I was saying of how much time do we want to give to all this? How much time can we commit? How soon in the year do we need to start thinking about bed prep, etc.? All working backwards in the UK, at least, from that magic moment, that magic date of the 1st of June when we should be out of the danger of frost. So there we have it. Now I need to start thinking about sorting out my seeds and seeing what I need to order, which will be a joyous time. So I can't wait to get stuck into that, and I'll bring you along for that when I do it too. But in the meantime, look after yourselves, have fun planning, and if, like me, you make mistakes, fine, scribble out, start again. Get it just how you want it to be. This is the time when we can really enjoy this process of dreaming of the perfect garden, which won't be perfect, it never is eventually. But right now we can dream perfection, can't we? So until the next time, everyone, cheerio.